There are zombies in your iPhone. Let me back up a bit. As you write bigger and more complex applications, there's a very common problem you're going to run across, and it's a bit of a mystery situation. The problem is this. You're going to get an error message, exe bad access, or in some cases, exe bad instruction. What it's really telling you is there's a bit of code trying to access an object that's not there anymore. So let me kind of illustrate that. Back to our chunk of memory that we have to play with. We write some code that creates a new customer object and calls it foo. That gets allocated and initialized in memory, and we have a pointer pointing to it. Now that object knows it's a customer object. So we can work with it, we can call methods on the object, we can manipulate it, we can pass it around, we can do things with it. But at some point, being good iPhone programmers, we're going to say release. And then that object and that area of memory will be reclaimed, it will be destroyed and available for reuse. Now at some point then in the future, we kind of move into a different context and we forget about that code. The issue is that we still have this variable that's pointing to a location in memory, but there's just nothing there anymore. And if we try and access it, either by calling a normal method on it, or say by calling even the release method, which will exist on everything, you're going to get exe bad access. You're going to get an error message that's telling you there's a problem here because you're trying to use this variable to point to an object that no longer exists. There's an issue. And fine, you say. You think, okay, I can debug that. Let me know what object it was that's been released. And of course, the answer is, we don't know. It's been released. It's not there anymore. Even if you know which line of code caused this problem to happen, that may not be enough. You may be in a loop or another complex piece of logic. It's very difficult to debug because it's tough to narrow down an extra release when you don't know what object has gone away. So this is where zombies come in. And I'm not making something up. There's a place in Xcode where you can enable zombies. And what this means, well, let's go over the same situation and show the difference with zombies enabled. So we write a line of code and it creates a customer object and points our variable foo to that. Then we can work with that because it knows it's a customer object. We can call its methods. We can work with the instance variables. We can pass it around and so on. And at some point, we call release. The difference is, rather than that area of memory completely being reclaimed, it gets held onto, and we basically have it turned into a zombie, a husk of what the object used to be. It's saying, I used to be a customer, now I'm a zombie. Now the difference is that at some point in the future, you're going to try and access this object that really doesn't exist anymore. But in this case, the call still won't work, but you'll get a more useful log message because it's keeping track of what that object used to be. Now, one of the dangers here is you don't want to leave this on all the time because it does mean that area of memory is not being reclaimed properly. So you can't just leave zombies on, but they're a great debugging tool because they'll let you find out what used to take that space up that used to be an object. So let's take a look at how we actually do that in our program. So I have jumped into just a very simple starter file. It's zombie starter that's available if you want it. Really all that I'm doing here is having a very simple command line tool. It's a foundation tool. And I've got a couple of simple classes. In fact, I've got a couple of simple objects being created. There's one class called the exercise class. Just has a few instance variables and a single method called calculate time. And the only reason that I've created this is just to have something to create, to have something for our main method to do. So what we have in the main method is on line 5, we're allocating and initializing a new instance of the exercise class. Then for the next few lines, we're setting some instance variables of it. On line 9, we call the calculate time, which is going to output a little message to the console, and then we release it. And then we create another object. This object is called B. It's of type exercise. We set its values. On line 16, we call its method calculate time. And then on line 17, we release that. And you can imagine that at some point you've got all sorts of other bits of code going on, but sometime later we come down to line 20. And line 20 says a release. Release this one again, but it's already been released. So this call on line 20 could be a call to the release. It could be a call to any of the other methods that are part of that object. But this shouldn't work at this point. So what I'm going to do is run this program. I'm going to do it by opening up the console and just clicking build and go within the console. And now notice that because we're in debug mode by default, the debugger has already kicked off. What we're getting is we're getting 2 lines that say this exercise will take 48 seconds to perform, this exercise will take 50 seconds to perform. That's because that's the calculate time method that's being called on object A and object B. And then we get a problem, freed, message release sent to freed object. And there's a little 0x1032F0, which is really the location in memory. Now we're really paused now at the point where we're trying to release it again. If I was to click continue, what I'd actually see as I kept doing it is program receives signal, exe bad instruction, exe bad instruction, exe bad instruction. And I'd be trying to figure out, okay, what's going on? There's a bad instruction happening, some kind of problem here, but I don't quite know what it is because I don't know what's receiving that signal. I don't know what this used to be. So I'm going to hit the stop button and go back into the code, and I'm going to enable zombies. The way that I do this is by expanding over here on the left-hand pane the executables section, and this is what's basically defining what your application is going to be bundled into, effectively your application itself. I'm going to right-click this or control-click and select Get Info. You can also double-click and that will work. And what happens is this gives you a sheet up with a few different pieces of information about this executable, some general information, some arguments, some debugging, and some comments. We want to be in the arguments section, and it says, well, I can give it some arguments to be passed on launch. It's not that we want. We need an environment variable set, so it's the lower section here. And I'm going to click the plus button, but make sure you click the plus button right at the bottom. I click that one, add new setting, and what I type is NS zombie enabled. Be careful with the case sensitivity here. NSZ are all in uppercase, and so is the E, and it's zombie enabled, not zombies enabled, which is a very common mistake. And then I'm going to give it the value of yes in all in uppercase because it is a bool built into Objective-C. So NS zombie enabled is yes. I'm going to then close that, go back and open my console from the run menu. I'm going to clear the log just so I make it easier to look at, and then click build and go. So I run it, and of course it doesn't work. I'm not expecting this to work. I'm getting my 2 messages being output by my objects, and then getting exercise release, message sent to deallocated instance. Now I could also try and continue again. And if you remember the last time when I tried to continue, all I was getting was the exe bad instruction. If I now hit continue, what's happening is it's saying, okay, name of the project, which is zombie starter, NS invocation warning, object of class NS zombie exercise, does not implement method signature for selector, trouble ahead, and then a matching one that says abort. Now the important thing is what's actually at the start of each of those second lines where it says NS zombie underscore exercise. This is really the zombie version of your object. If it was a customer object, it would be NS zombie underscore customer. If it was an account object, it would be NS zombie underscore account. And this is actually what's telling you what your object used to be, was having zombies enabled on it. Oh, it was an exercise object. Okay, so that's giving you a bit more of a clue about what you're trying to release. I'm going to hit stop, and again, just you only ever want to have this on while you're using it. I'm going to double click that executable, and you can turn it off temporarily and turn it back on, but do make sure that you remove it before you actually launch your program for good, because what's happening, of course, with zombies enabled is no area of memory really gets reclaimed, so it's quite inefficient to keep it on. But that is zombies, so it can be very useful for letting you know what an object used to be that's already been released.